On December 7, 1941, as Pearl Harbor burned in smoke and fire, a different air war was quietly beginning across Southeast Asia. At makeshift air bases in Burma and China, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Mitsubishi A-6M Zero fighters reigned supreme in the skies. They embodied aerial arrogance. The Chinese Nationalist Air Force and the USAAC's deployed P-40 Warhawks were, in the eyes of Japanese pilots, apprentice machines. The Zero flew with almost supernatural speed and agility. It could pull off tight turns without bleeding speed, an illusion of invincibility. Japanese pilots, who had been carving up the Asian skies since 1937, viewed the bulky P-40 as a mobile target, a sluggish slab of metal unworthy of their skill. They openly mocked the less experienced American pilots, who were forced to maintain their conservative combat formations. Initial encounters often ended swiftly and brutally, with the Zero gliding past the Warhawks like a hawk passing over sparrows. This arrogance was not just talk, it was embedded in their combat philosophy. Individual skill would determine the outcome of every aerial engagement. The morning sun glinted off turning propellers, reflecting the absolute confidence of pilots who believed they were destined to rule the airspace. But behind this curtain of scorn, one man was preparing a tactical shift, a shift that would turn the Japanese scornful laughter into cries of desperation.
In Chungking, under the patronage of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, Lieutenant Colonel Claire Lee Chennault secretly organized and commanded the American Volunteer Group, famously known as the Flying Tigers. This unit was different. They were not regular army personnel, but highly paid mercenaries fighting for China. Chennault understood a core truth that the contemporary U.S. Army Air Force had yet to grasp. The P-40 could not beat the Zero in a war of attrition or a prolonged turning dogfight. The Zero held advantages in altitude, maneuverability, and incredible turning radius. Chennault instilled a new combat doctrine. Air combat was not a contest of individual finesse. It was about systematic destruction. His men were drilled to avoid direct confrontation. They had to exploit the P-40's superior dive speed, like a shark plunging downwards, deliver calculated bursts of fire, and immediately disengage before the Zero pilot could react. Photographs from fighter cameras after the Flying Tigers' initial battles began to show an astonishing result, shaking the Japanese's firm belief. The first few weeks of organized engagements were a painful education for the Japanese Army Air Force. On December 20, 1941, during an engagement near Kunming, a Tiger flight under an American officer applied the new tactics. Instead of engaging Zero patrols head-on, they climbed high, then dove straight down at maximum velocity. The Japanese pilots, seeing the P-40s approaching at such incredible speed, attempted their signature tight turns to counter, but the Zero's inertia and design would not allow it at that velocity. A Zero pilot had to witness his P-40 adversary close in from a blind spot, unleash a short, precise burst into the engine, the boom and zoom working perfectly. As at least 5 Zeros fell to earth in under 10 minutes of combat, the derision vanished, replaced by a cold bewilderment. Early reports from the Japanese side began to use wary language, describing the P-40s as sudden assassins, unpredictable. The shift in the Flying Tigers' tactics created a deep psychological crisis within the ranks of Japanese pilots. They were accustomed to hunting, not being hunted. Their training system emphasized individual flying skill, believing that one good Zero pilot could defeat 3 enemy aircraft. Chennault's strategy, however, demanded tight teamwork, patience,
and the discipline to only fight when a clear advantage was present. This ran directly counter to their ingrained ethos. Intelligence reports collected suggested Japanese pilots began to display excessive caution, fearing to fly at low altitudes or alone. They started altering their habits, something that their Japanese commanders vehemently opposed. This newfound hesitation reduced their combat effectiveness. They had lost the element of surprise and the necessary recklessness to overwhelm opponents. The initial confidence curdled into an obsession with the blind spot, a completely new concept for them in the Chinese sky.
While the Flying Tigers proved the P-40's worth on the battlefield, a silent production race was underway on the home front. The United States, with its immense industrial might, began to address the supply chain for the Tigers. Although the P-40 was initially not the optimal American fighter design, the sheer quantity that Buffalo and Los Angeles factories were churning out was unimaginable to the Japanese. When a Zero was shot down, it could take months to replace the experienced pilot. Every lost P-40 meant another was ready to be shipped across perilous sea lanes or the long overland route through India. Japanese pilots, flying an aging and depleted fleet, began to face a cruel reality. They were fighting not just the enemy pilots, but the American assembly lines. They still possessed technically superior aircraft, but their numbers were rapidly diminishing while their enemies grew ever larger.
The theaters of operations in Burma and China were not flat training grounds. They were a tapestry of rugged terrain where seasonal monsoons turned airfields into swamps and thick fog obscured flight paths. Zeros, designed for short-range combat over the Pacific Islands, struggled to maintain continuous operations and maintenance in these conditions. Conversely, the P-40, though less elegant, was a rugged machine capable of operating from rudimentary strips. The Flying Tiger's ability to establish forward operating bases, however poorly equipped, gave them a crucial tactical edge. They could strike Japanese supply lines and retreat before Japanese forces could mass for a counterattack. This was mobile warfare, and the P-40 proved it could withstand the brutality of the environment better than its supposedly superior counterpart.
As the loss rate for the Zero mounted to an unacceptable level, the Japanese Army Air Force leadership was forced to order a change. They recognized that their freewheeling, evasive maneuvers were useless against the straight-in, high-speed attacks. The new order demanded that Zero pilots hunt the P-40s by forcing them into extended turning dogfights, despite the risk of bleeding off vital energy. This was an inadvertent admission of failure in countering Chennault's boom and zoom philosophy. However, this tactical change also pulled the Japanese pilots out of their comfort zone and into situations they were ill-equipped to handle. Disappointment spread. The best pilots, accustomed to leading the charge, were now forced into inefficient air duels just to avoid being downed by a sudden P-40 attack.
While aircraft numbers could be replaced, experienced pilots could not. Every downed Zero meant the permanent loss of a veteran pilot, as the Japanese training pipeline could not produce new pilots as fast as the Americans could manufacture aircraft. The downed Flying Tigers, if they survived, were often retrieved and sent back into the fight. Japanese pilots did not have this luxury. This gradual erosion of pilot quality was a mortal wound. The smiles in the Japanese cockpits now carried a different shade. It was weariness, a hidden anxiety. They no longer saw the P-40s as easy targets, but as cold phantoms carrying death at high speed, lurking above the dust clouds of China.
As WW2 progressed, the role of the Flying Tigers transitioned into becoming part of the U.S. 14th Air Force, yet their legacy was set. They had proven that an aircraft with an inferior appearance, when flown with intelligent tactics and supported by robust logistics, could subdue a theoretically superior opponent. The initial mockery of the P-40 was shattered. The air dominance the Japanese once enjoyed had been seriously compromised over the skies of China. The later arrival of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts only built upon this lesson. But for the airmen over China in 1941-1942, the truth was shaped by a series of unforgiving dives. The P-40 Warhawk, dismissed as mere child's play, completed its mission. It sowed doubt and began to fracture the Japanese Empire's dream of a swift aerial victory.
The events over the Chinese skies were an omen for the entire Pacific War. They taught the Allies that no aircraft is invincible, but more importantly, they taught the Axis powers that blind confidence and an unyielding adherence to outdated doctrine would lead to disaster. The P-40s were not romantic. They were effective tools wielded by men who respected speed and exploited their advantage. The mocking smiles of early 1942 had turned into whispered fears of Chennault's savage pilots and their predatory aircraft. The initial aerial supremacy enjoyed by Japan was mortally wounded over China,